Hello there, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel, Analyze This Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. Today we're digging into the adventures of another spy, that is Ethan Hunt of the Mission Impossible films. So maybe this episode should be called Analyze This Mr. Hunt. The Mission Impossible films have often been seen as a competitor to the Bond films. The series has never really been shy about that. When Tom Cruise acquired the rights to make a Mission Impossible movie, he was seeking a vehicle to create a kind of James Bond series for himself. And some of the movies have leaned into that a little bit more than others, but you certainly see the influence of James Bond on the Mission Impossible films, even though the Mission Impossible film ethos is pretty different from the James Bond film ethos. And that could honestly be a video unto itself, just discussing the different sources of energy for a Mission Impossible movie versus a Bond movie. But Mission Impossible, from its TV show roots all the way through to the most recent film to release, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning, has always been powered first and foremost by set pieces, and not just any type of set pieces, but set pieces that are particularly structured around intricate clockwork obstacles that individuals have to overcome. It is about building a obstacle course for the characters to navigate, and it's no surprise that the films tend to structure themselves as just a series of obstacle courses for Tom Cruise's Ethan Hunt to overcome, usually through incredible feats of daring do. Ethan Hunt and Tom Cruise have blurred together in the public imagination. They are both figures who push themselves to the limit to make sure they achieve their mission. I've enjoyed the Mission Impossible series greatly. In fact, I grew up watching reruns of the television series, so I was very excited when I finally got to see the Tom Cruise movie directed by Brian De Palma, which is still my favorite of the series to this day, but I've followed the movies sequentially and have had a very good time with them. They're reliably sound blockbusters. But I think the Mission Impossible films started to veer slightly off course a number of films ago, and the mistake that series started to make is a mistake that we saw similarly in the Daniel Craig era and have seen in the Fast and Furious franchise. It's a problem not unique to the Mission Impossible series, in other words, but it's kind of a problem that has infected the industry on the whole, and many of our franchises are suffering from it. And that mistake is fundamentally about misunderstanding what audiences want from an action and adventure film. An audience shows up to an action and adventure film, which usually runs for 2 or 3 hours, to experience a roller coaster ride of thrills, regardless of whether that's suspense or big action set pieces. It can vary, but it's essentially about momentum. It is about forward action. The characters we're watching in these stories are characters we want to see continuing to respond to new scenarios, reacting, and overcoming them. In many ways, the characters at the center of these stories are vehicles. They are less fully fledged characters than they are interesting figures that are fairly reactive. You know, if you think about Indiana Jones, yes, as the movies go on, they kind of add more layers to his character, but essentially the core appeal of Indiana Jones isn't that he's this character with this robust backstory and really intricate set of complex emotional desires. He's an adventure hero. And the appeal of watching Harrison Ford's Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark is just watching him react to these events in real time, because he's charismatic and it's funny, and the character is expressed in those reactions. The character comes out in reacting to circumstance. It's not about learning about the character because the character has so many deep conversations about their existential fears and what they want or desire. It's really about watching a character with a fairly clear goal go through great obstacles to achieve it. You could say the same about, John McClane, the man who walks on glass to save his wife from terrorists, or James Bond, who in his traditional form is typically just opposed against a very clearly delineated villain. And the conflict in a classic Bond film is about Bond thwarting the villain. There's not really much about the Bond character himself. And Ethan Hunt is similarly that kind of vehicle. He's introduced in the first Mission Impossible movie as just another working stiff who gets in over his head. He's just part of a team that gets obliterated. And the Ethan Hunt character is then malleable over the next few movies. In Mission Impossible 2, he's a super-powered James Bondian action figure. But by the time you get to the third movie, you start to see the creep of this sense that they feel like they need to take Ethan Hunt, the shell, and give him something a little bit more. So that story becomes about Ethan Hunt trying to escape the spy life, settle down, get married. And that's when the series starts to waver a little bit, I think. I think it doesn't go over the brink because by the time you get to the next movie, Ghost Protocol, that movie almost throws the story out the window. Ghost Protocol, I think, is one of the more successful Mission Impossible movies because it understands that the story doesn't really matter. What it really is a sequence of almost Rube Goldberg-like contraptions for Tom Cruise to navigate. Everything is going wrong all the time, and everything is frenetic and chaotic, and the obstacles are just simple things like equipment going wrong or an unexpected sandstorm coming in to derail a mission midway through. All of those kinds of obstacles are great for Tom Cruise, one of the last true movie stars to play against. Tom Cruise has such tremendous screen presence and charisma, and in many ways, his character of Ethan Hunt works best when he just leans into that. It's a vehicle for Tom Cruise's natural star presence. But even at the end of that movie, it calls back to this idea of the absent wife. And then you start to get this sense that we're building this lore around the Ethan Hunt character. He's not just a man of action anymore, but he's a character with a history. And the team starts to become less of a group of professionals that he pulls in to work with, but a web of connected family members. And I love many of those family members. I love seeing Ving Rhames pop up in these movies again and again. But there's a sense in which the series starts to get bogged down at this point with all these relationships and this history. And by the time you get to the most recent Mission Impossible movie, Dead Reckoning, they're creating this convoluted backstory where Tom Cruise's Ethan Hunt had some sort of formative tragedy with the love of his life, a kind of Vesper-like figure that's just inserted vaguely into flashbacks in the movie, presumably to set up something in the next film, which is 2 months away from releasing Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning. But there's no real payoff for that addition, and you start to feel that the characters are just kind of popping in and out just to have characters show up that you recognize without giving them a lot of stuff to do, without justifying their presence in the movie. And I think that shows a slight misunderstanding of what these movies are about. An action-adventure film is not really designed to play like television. Yeah, we could look at the Marvel movies and say they employed a kind of serialized storytelling, but really the core Marvel movie set building up to the Avengers and even up through Endgame and Infinity War, those are mostly standalone movies. Sure, characters pop in and out of them, and there are kind of slight Easter eggs that carry through, but they're mostly standalone adventures. And the Mission Impossible movies have gotten to the point where they're no longer standalone adventures. In fact, if you watch the trailer for the upcoming movie, The Final Reckoning, they're calling back to past Mission Impossible adventures. There are characters and direct references to the first Mission Impossible. The Rabbit's Foot, the MacGuffin of Mission Impossible 3, is showing up again. They're building this web of connections that just feels like it's bogging things down. All I really want to do is show up at the movie theater and see Ethan Hunt do impossible things and essentially get punished along the way. I want to see him just be put through the ringer. I want to see Tom Cruise endure to the end across the most harrowing of challenges. That's what I want to see. I don't really need to know about the backstory of Ethan Hunt. The backstory of Ethan Hunt could maybe be a useful story device if you're going to really layer that into the character relationships. But if you're just going to give me backstory for the sake of backstory and not pay it off, and I felt like that's what this most recent film did, you're really starting to lose me a little bit on that. Characters don't need to show up from previous installments unless you're really going to give them something to do. I don't need to see the culmination of a Ethan Hunt arc. I just need to have a really good time. And we saw that with the Daniel Craig Bond movies. The Daniel Craig Bond movies started establishing this web of lore that didn't really feel earned and started leaning into aspects of Bond's character that didn't really need to be there. For example, Skyfall and its detour into Bond's childhood was a welcome change of pace, but getting a second helping of that in Spectre was arguably and almost certainly unnecessary. It didn't really bring a lot to the table that Bond's childhood played into the story of Spectre in some way. Similarly, I'm worried with the Mission Impossible series that as they build up to this next movie, which is being advertised as the conclusion of the Mission Impossible arc, that they've kind of lost something of the spirit of Mission Impossible along the way. Mission Impossible is about forward momentum. It's not about the exposition. The exposition only exists to provide a foundation for the set pieces. And similarly, in James Bond, the story is just a framework in which Bond can react to the scenarios that he's been put in. And so really these stories are more about the immediate challenges for these characters, the relationships that create dramatic tension for them, than it is about what the impossible mission force's relationship is with the broader intelligence apparatus of the American government. In fact, the television series just sent the team off on a mission. You never really saw who was giving the team a mission. They just picked up a tape from somewhere and then they were off to the races. And you didn't even really get much introduction to the characters at all. They were just a group of professionals working together. And you somewhat got to know those characters as the episodes went on. But there wasn't this big emphasis on these characters' backstories and their, unique baggage. Ian Fleming described James Bond as a silhouette at the end of his book Moonraker, and less flatteringly as a cardboard booby when he was, I believe, writing a letter complaining about the character a little bit. There's a sense in which these characters are defined with dotted lines, and that's because they're vehicles as well as characters. And that is even more true of Ethan Hunt than it is of James Bond. James Bond has a very particular cultural milieu that he's anchored in, a very clear set of appetites that drive that character, a very clear fatalistic mindset. Ethan Hunt doesn't have a lot of those things. In fact, his character has been a little bit inconsistent from movie to movie. Ethan Hunt has been a purposefully malleable character. In fact, the original conception of the series was that the series would almost be reinvented top down every time a new director came on board. It's why you had Brian De Palma do the first one, John Woo with his radically different style tackle the second. The third film was going to go to David Fincher for his take. It kind of settled into this groove where the films build up this momentum, and it's been lovely to get some of these characters carry through. And my point is not that they can't deviate from formula. I think no series that has been long running has ever been successful without deviations. It's one reason I think the Craig era was so vital in rejuvenating Bond after the formula of Bond had become a little bit stale. Die Another Day does the formula relatively rigidly. It plays with it a little bit, but not enough. And it was really great to have the Daniel Craig era shake things up. But there's also a sense that if you're going to deviate from formula, you really have to have a good destination. If you're going to deviate from what the primary drive of the series is, you have to make sure that that stuff delivers. And I think a lot of the dry exposition in the Mission Impossible movies, just like in some of the Daniel Craig movies, is just dead air, essentially. I don't need to sit through minutes upon minutes of characters talking about a glorified Skynet, just like I don't need to see M talk about how 00 agents compare to drones. I say this as someone who is very much looking forward to the next Mission Impossible movie. I hope it's going to blow me away. I really want to see Tom Cruise leave this series on a strong note. So I have nothing but hope for it. But I can't help feeling like it would have been nicer to have something that was a little bit more pared down as the final send-off for this character. Something that was a little leaner, a little meaner, something that got back to the heart of Mission Impossible, which is just a small group of people being put in an impossible situation and having to work their way out of it. So, thanks for listening to my rambling. Let me know if you agree or disagree with me. And as always, I'll catch you in the next one.